When I first saw the old cabin, it looked like something out of a forgotten photograph. Weathered logs, moss-covered roof, and tall pines guarding it like silent sentinels. It sat at the edge of a shimmering lake, far from the noise of the city and even farther from the reach of HOA rules. I'd been searching for a place that felt alive with history, somewhere I could restore piece by piece and call my own. The real estate agent told me the property had been abandoned for over 30 years. Most buyers saw it as a lost cause, but I saw a hidden treasure waiting to breathe again. The cabin had a soul. You could feel it in the creak of the porch and the smell of old cedar trapped in its walls. I spent hours walking through each room, imagining what it looked like in its prime. Fire crackling in the stone hearth, lanterns glowing through frosted windows, laughter echoing across the lake. The agent mentioned there had been some local disputes about the land's history, but he assured me everything was legally cleared. I didn't think much of it. After all, who could possibly lay claim to a place left untouched for generations? The moment I signed the deed, I felt a strange mix of pride and peace. Finally, I had found my escape. A project worth every splinter and drop of sweat it would take to bring it back to life. I spent my first day cleaning up the front porch, stacking old timber and brushing off decades of dust. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the steps, watching the golden light fade over the water. I had no idea that my dream restoration was about to stir a hornet's nest of entitlement, jealousy, and HOA fury waiting just beyond the tree line. The next morning I loaded my truck with tools and supplies, eager to start cleaning the interior. As I parked near the cabin, a sleek silver SUV came speeding up the dirt road, dust billowing behind it. Out stepped a woman dressed far too formally for the countryside. Heels, pearls, and a bright pink blazer that seemed to clash with the wilderness around her. She didn't introduce herself. She just pointed at me like I was trespassing. "Excuse me," she shouted. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" I paused, confused, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Your property? Ma'am, I bought this cabin last month." That's when she said it, the words that would set everything in motion. "That's supposed to be my son's inheritance." Her voice cracked with outrage. I tried to explain that the estate had gone into foreclosure years ago, but she didn't want facts. She wanted control. She stormed around the porch, snapping pictures with her phone, muttering about illegally acquired land. I introduced myself politely, told her she could check public records, but she just laughed bitterly. "You think some piece of paper means anything? My family has claimed this land for generations." She finally identified herself as Karen, president of the nearby HOA, even though my cabin was miles outside their jurisdiction. She boasted about her connections in town, saying she could make things difficult for me if I didn't cooperate. When I asked what she meant, she just smiled coldly and said, "You'll see." Then she climbed back into her SUV and sped off, leaving a trail of dust and tension behind. I stood there on the porch staring after her, realizing this wasn't just about land or property. It was about pride, legacy, and a woman who couldn't stand the thought of losing control. The harassment started subtly, almost like a bad joke. A few days after our confrontation, I found a folded letter nailed to my cabin door. It was an official-looking notice with the HOA logo stamped across the top, declaring I was in violation of Neighborhood Code Section 4.7, Unapproved Exterior Modifications. I laughed out loud. My property wasn't even within their borders. But when I called the HOA office, the receptionist coldly replied, "All properties in the surrounding district must adhere to our standards." That's when I realized Karen wasn't bluffing. She was trying to rope me into her empire of control. The next few weeks felt like living under surveillance. Every time I stepped outside to hammer a nail or chop wood, her silver SUV would appear at the edge of the tree line, headlights idling like a predator's eyes. One evening I caught her on camera walking up my driveway, taking photos of my lumber pile and tools. She later claimed she was documenting environmental hazards. Soon after, I got a visit from county officers responding to a noise complaint, filed anonymously, of course. They looked around, saw nothing wrong and apologized, but I could see in their eyes they'd been misled. Then came the online smear campaign. Posts appeared on the local community page accusing me of destroying historic property and polluting the lake. Every comment came from HOA members loyal to Karen. I tried to ignore it, but it wore me down. My peaceful restoration had turned into a silent war. Yet beneath my frustration, a spark of determination began to grow. If Karen thought intimidation would scare me off, she didn't know who she was dealing with. I wasn't just fixing an old cabin anymore, I was defending it. I decided to drown out the noise and focus on what I came here for: restoration. The cabin had stood for a century and a half. It deserved to be reborn. Each morning I woke with the sun, determined to make progress no matter what obstacles Karen threw at me. I replaced broken floorboards, patched up the crumbling chimney, and restained the logs to bring back their rich chestnut color. The smell of sawdust and fresh varnish filled the air, a reminder that I was turning neglect into life again. But the more the cabin transformed, the more aggressive Karen became. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, I discovered a small wooden chest tucked beneath loose floorboards. Inside were handwritten letters dating back to the late 1800s, correspondence between the original owners, a young couple who built the cabin with their own hands. They wrote about hardships, storms, and their dream of leaving a legacy for future generations. Reading their words felt like they were speaking directly to me. It gave my work a deeper purpose. I wasn't just restoring a house, I was preserving history. That night I sat by the fireplace, rereading those letters by lantern light, when I noticed headlights outside. Karen's SUV lingered on the road, engine idling, lights aimed right at my cabin. I watched from the window as she sat there for several minutes before finally driving off. It wasn't just harassment anymore, it was intimidation. She wanted to break my spirit, to make me give up and leave. But the opposite happened. The more she pushed, the stronger my resolve grew. This cabin had survived storms, decay, and time itself. I decided then and there it would survive her too. And so would I. A week later, I came home from the hardware store to find something new nailed to my front door. This time, a bright red notice that read, HO property seizure. Cease occupation immediately. My stomach twisted, and for a moment, I just stood there in disbelief. I wasn't under their control. They had no authority here. But there it was, stamped with Karen's name and signature, along with a phony official HO seal. Before I could even take it down, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Karen's SUV rolled up, and out she came, phone in hand, recording like she just caught a criminal. "I told you this property was never yours," she said smugly, circling the porch like she owned it. "We've voted to reclaim it for historical preservation." Her tone made it sound like she was doing the world a favor. I told her once again that my land wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, but she ignored me. Then, to my shock, a young man climbed out of the passenger seat, her son. Dressed in a designer jacket and sunglasses, he looked more like someone heading to a nightclub than visiting a cabin. Karen turned to him dramatically. "This is your inheritance," she said, loud enough for my camera to pick up. "Your grandfather built this land, and I'm taking it back for you." The boy barely looked interested, scrolling on his phone as she continued her rant. I called the sheriff's office, and when the deputy arrived, Karen changed her tune, pretending it was a simple misunderstanding. The deputy made her leave but warned me she'd likely be back. As I watched her SUV disappear down the road, I realized this wasn't over. Karen wasn't just obsessed with control anymore, she was obsessed with revenge. After that confrontation, I knew I couldn't rely on warnings or logic to stop Karen. She believed she owned history itself, and nothing short of proof would make her back off. So I decided to dig into the cabin's past and trace every document tied to the land. The next morning I drove to the county records office, where a kind clerk helped me sift through stacks of dusty ledgers and microfilm reels. Hours passed before I finally found it. A full record of ownership transfers dating back to the 1800s. Karen's family name appeared only once, and even then, it was marked with a foreclosure stamp from decades ago. Her grandfather had lost this land fair and square after years of unpaid taxes. As I pieced together the history, I discovered letters from the original family that matched the ones I'd found in the attic. It was clear, they were the rightful owners, and the deed had passed through their descendants before reaching me. I made certified copies of everything, from the foreclosure notice to my legal deed, and stored them safely in a folder marked proof of ownership. If Karen wanted a fight, I was ready for it. That evening, as I reviewed the paperwork on my porch, I caught sight of her SUV creeping slowly past the gate again. She stopped long enough to glare through the windshield before speeding off. It was obvious she knew I was digging into the truth. But now I had more than just words, I had irrefutable evidence. The cabin's history was mine to protect, and I wasn't about to let her rewrite it for her family's ego. For the first time since this mess began, I felt calm. I had facts, law, and the past itself on my side. The morning of the confrontation felt off from the moment I woke up. The birds were quiet, the air heavy, as if the forest itself knew something was coming. I stepped outside with my coffee and froze. A convoy of trucks and SUVs was parked along the dirt road. At the front stood Karen, clipboard in hand, flanked by 3 HOA board members in matching polo shirts and name tags. Behind them, a construction crew unloaded tools and demolition gear. My stomach dropped. They were planning to tear something down. Karen strutted toward me, waving a stack of papers. "We're here to remove unsafe structures," she announced, gesturing toward my cabin as if it were condemned property. "You've had your fun, but this land is being restored to its rightful status." Her workers started up chainsaws before I could respond. I pulled out my phone and began filming. "You're trespassing," I said, calm but firm. She smirked. "You can't trespass on community property." That's when I pulled out my binder of documents, the deed, historical records, and the county map proving my land was outside their jurisdiction. I held it up for the camera and her crew to see. "Community property?" I said. "This is privately owned land purchased legally, and I have every record right here." Her confident mask cracked. The crew hesitated, lowering their tools as they realized she had no authority to order them. Karen's face twisted with rage. "You think paperwork scares me?" she spat. "You're stealing my family's legacy." But I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, still recording, as she shouted and sputtered. Eventually, the workers refused to continue without legal clearance. Her entire operation fell apart before my eyes. For once, it wasn't me on the defensive. She was the one cornered. After that chaotic morning, I wasted no time. I called the county inspector and forwarded all my recordings, emails, and the HOA's false notices. Within hours, he and a local sheriff arrived at the cabin to assess the situation. Karen was still parked on the road, pacing furiously and barking orders into her phone. When she saw the 2 officials step out of their vehicles, her face drained of color. I could almost see the confidence melt off her. The inspector walked the property, reviewed my paperwork, and confirmed everything I already knew. The HOA had absolutely zero jurisdiction here. When the sheriff approached Karen, she immediately launched into her speech about community preservation and stolen family heritage. But the sheriff cut her off. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you and your group are trespassing on private property. You'll need to leave immediately." She argued, of course, claiming she had historical rights. That's when I handed the sheriff my binder of documents. He flipped through it and nodded. "Everything checks out. This is a legal purchase." He turned to Karen again. "If you step foot here again without permission, you'll be charged." Karen's voice shook as she tried one last defense, accusing me of harassment and forging papers. The sheriff gave her a long, unimpressed look. "We'll verify every page," he said. "But if these are real, and they appear to be, you're the one breaking the law." She sputtered something about calling her lawyer before storming back to her SUV. The HOA trucks left one by one, their engines fading into the forest. As the dust settled, the sheriff patted me on the shoulder. "You handled this better than most folks would," he said. Watching them disappear down the road, I finally exhaled. The cabin stood untouched, strong and defiant, just like I intended it to be. In the weeks that followed, the story spread faster than wildfire. The once feared HOA president had been publicly humiliated, her authority dismantled by her own arrogance. People in town began whispering about what happened, the woman who tried to steal a cabin and lost everything in the process. I didn't have to say a word. The truth traveled on its own. For years, Karen had bullied residents, fining them for minor infractions and threatening to seize their property if they didn't comply. Now, neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with me started stopping by the cabin, curious and supportive. They told me how Karen had manipulated people with fear, pretending the HOA had power it didn't actually possess. One couple revealed she'd forced them to repaint their fence 3 times, just because it didn't match her aesthetic. Another said she once fined a retired veteran for having an unapproved flagpole. The more I heard, the more I realized this was bigger than me. My stand had given others the courage to push back. Meanwhile, Karen's life unraveled. Her son, embarrassed by the whole ordeal, moved out of town to escape the gossip. The HOA board voted to remove her as president after the county fined them heavily for overreach and trespassing. Her SUV no longer prowled the road by my cabin, and for the first time in months, the forest felt peaceful again. I threw myself back into finishing the restoration. The porch beams gleamed under fresh varnish, the fireplace stood proudly repaired, and the air smelled of pine and new beginnings. Each nail I drove felt like reclaiming a piece of peace she tried to take from me. The cabin was no longer just a project. It was proof that truth and persistence could silence even the loudest bullies. Months passed and the cabin finally stood complete, reborn from decay into something timeless. The logs glowed golden in the sunlight, the porch railings smooth and strong, and the reflection of the restored structure shimmered peacefully across the lake. I sent invitations to the local historical society, nearby residents, and even the county officials who had helped during the ordeal. On the day of the unveiling, cars lined the narrow road as people gathered to see what had once been a forgotten ruin. The laughter, the chatter, the scent of fresh wood. It all made the long fight worth it. During the small ceremony, the head of the historical committee handed me a bronze plaque recognizing the cabin as an officially registered historical landmark. For preserving the legacy of those who built it and the spirit of those who stood their ground, the inscription read. I felt a lump in my throat as I mounted it beside the front steps. The crowd clapped, and for the first time I truly felt that the cabin and I belonged here. I noticed Karen's SUV creeping by on the distant road, slowing for a moment before speeding away. She didn't stop, didn't shout, didn't dare step foot near the property again. That was her silent surrender. The forest had reclaimed its peace, and so had I. As the sun set that evening, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the light fade across the water. The cabin no longer whispered of abandonment or struggle. It hummed with life again. I had restored more than a building. I had restored dignity, history, and a sense of belonging. The battle with Karen was over, but the legacy of the cabin, and the peace it gave me, would last for generations.